How's it going, Hamily? Today we're going to be taking a look at two bills that have been proposed to the House of Representatives, one having to do with HOA restrictions or private land use restrictions. Second, we'll be taking a look at a proposal to remove baud rate restrictions on amateur radio digital modes and would change to something of just a bandwidth size, a maximum bandwidth use. So if you go to the web, a couple of things I want you to know about. The ARRL's homepage has a news and events link, which is right here. If you see that, you can find out a lot about different amateur radio news that's going on. The first bill we're going to be taking a look at was submitted by Representative Bill Johnson, and the idea is that it would remove or eliminate restrictions on private land use regarding amateur radio. I will post a link in the description so you can go take a look at the article at the ARRL. However, I have already gone into the PDF and I focused on the areas that I think are the most important, at least the stuff that I think is interesting to amateur radio operators, because how it could affect us in the future if this gets to go to the Senate and ultimately goes into enforcement. So the bill, which is in this form of a PDF file that you can get from the ARRL website, I would recommend you do so. Actually, both bills are going to have some boilerplate here that make a call out to 770 amateur radio operators. They use different verbiage here, but basically saying there's a decent chunk of us, and that for a while now, amateur radio operators, particularly in the world of homeowners associations, have been prohibited from putting up their own antennas or really restricted on what types of antennas they can use. And in some places, the prohibition of anything that isn't a television antenna or something like a radio receiving antenna for like shortwave radio or AM radio, so long as it fits in a certain size dimensions. A lot of them require these crazy dimension rules that you have to consider and comply to. But I've made some important highlights that I think we should hit. Within the PDF towards the beginning, it states, however, amateur stations have been shown to be frequently and increasingly precluded by unreasonable private land use restrictions, including restrictive covenants. To further the public interest benefits that amateur radio brings to society, private land use restrictions that prohibit, restrict, or impair amateur operators from operating, installing, or maintaining effective outdoor amateur station antenna structures should be preempted. So they're basically saying if you live in an area where you have some kind of agreement, like with an HOA or something that would preclude your personal use of your land, that should be prohibited and prevented from going into effect. In general, a private land use restriction that prohibits, restricts, or impairs or has the effect of prohibiting, restricting, or impairing an amateur operator from operating, installing, or maintaining any amateur station, antenna on property subject to the control of the amateur operator may not be adopted or enforced except as permitted by Section B. And here is Section B, and this is the most important parts. So it breaks this down into A through E, E being the most important that you should know about if this goes into effect. The bill is basically saying that we should not be restricted from doing anything we want unless it is something to do with these 5 subsections or clarifications on what level of restrictions there may be. So let's take a quick look at these. I think E, by the way, is the most important one, but we'll get to that at the end. A restriction that requires an amateur station antenna to be installed in compliance with the specifications of the manufacturer of antenna, the applicable zoning ordinances, amateur radio tower ordinances, if any, and governmentally adopted building codes. So that's kind of like saying, you can't have a tower too tall. We already have some ordinances and requirements in place for that. The only thing that's a little bit odd is the manufacturer specifications. Since a lot of us homebrew our stuff, I guess we could say, yeah, I could check the box on that one. This one I'm not that worried about. B, a restriction that requires an amateur station antenna to be maintained in a structurally safe condition. So this one, obviously, a lot of you are probably going, well, duh. But there's a bit of interest here, right? So if for some reason, let's say your antenna, a big antenna, fell over and damaged somebody's property, or fell on a person, right, and actually damage them, then this is kind of like basically saying if we go back around and we do an investigation, we found out that you were not compliant with whatever good maintenance would be for that antenna, you're obviously setting yourself up for a lawsuit. That's one thing, but you're kind of also potentially going to run afoul with an HOA if you constantly have an antenna that is a danger to the people around it, the structures, etc. So if you live in an HOA, the expectation is that you're going to maintain it to a high level of regard, which we all do as amateur radio operators anyway. So no big deal. C, a restriction that requires any deteriorated or structurally unsafe component of an amateur station antenna to be repaired, replaced, or removed. Makes sense. I have no issue with this. D, a restriction that requires an amateur station antenna to be removed if the property on which the antenna is located ceases to be subject to the control of an amateur operator. Sure, if you end up vacating the land that you are either owning or renting, that you would then have to take out the antennas. Makes sense. Now, the one of note here is broken across 2 pages, and we're going to take a look at this in a little bit greater detail. So this is E. And the verbiage of this is really specific, so we have to focus on what it's saying to the letter. Any restriction that requires an amateur station antenna grounded mounted electrical enclosure, ground mounted control enclosure, or guy wire anchor to be visually screened if such enclosure or anchor is visible from the street faced by the dwelling or is located in an unfenced side of the rear yard and is visible from an adjoining property. So this is an exception to the rule, meaning you shall not be barred from putting up an antenna except you have an amateur station antenna ground mounted electrical enclosure. So they're not saying a ground-mounted antenna. They're saying an electrical enclosure. To me, that screams something like what you might find on a vertical antenna, like a flagpole antenna. It has usually a box or maybe a faux stone that people will put an external tuner around, or possibly some kind of coax conduit box where you would put your connections for lightning ground and that kind of stuff. So it's basically saying if you have some kind of electrical enclosure, that it be obscured or screened visually if it's facing the street or dwelling or located in an unfenced side of a rear yard that is visible. But let's keep going because I find this one kind of funny. Or it's a ground-mounted control and structure. So again, that could be a tuner, right, or something along those lines in a box. You can't just have like a bare tuner out there, I guess, but those are kind of also obscured. Or a guy wire anchor. Not a guy wire anchor should be visually screened. So the huge antenna mast, if you've got a Roan tower, for instance, does not have to be screened, but that the little anchor bit of the guying wires does have to be screened. Guy wires? Nah, you don't have to screen those. That, to me, I don't understand this one. That's the only clarification point where I was like, that's written kind of weird. What do you mean by an amateur station antenna ground-mounted electrical enclosure? To me, that can mean lots of things, and it's already in an enclosure, and is that not screened enough? Also, what does visually screen mean? Like we use some camo netting or something like that? That seems like the HOA would be all kinds of pissed off about that. Or you put some plants around it or something like that? Okay, sure. Now, the second bill here is the nearest and dearest to my heart, and thank you, Representative Lesko, that introduces a bill to replace symbol rate limit with bandwidth limit. For a long time, we've had symbol rate limits that was imposed by the FCC. It was fine in the past, but now that we've gotten to the point that we can send data much faster with higher bandwidths and much better software applications for doing said data transmissions, we don't really need this symbol rate limit anymore. It's kind of like, give me what the upper speed limit is on the RF highway and let me cruise at the velocity I so desire, or the bandwidth size. More bandwidth means we can transmit more data faster, meaning we're not transmitting as much, meaning that we're just doing short little bursts potentially, even for WinLink in some cases, and then we're getting off the bands again, we're freeing them up, we're making them available for other people. These are good things. Now, for both these bills, again, I highly recommend you go to the link in the description and read the articles from the ARRL because they add their own insight and opinions to these, and you can also find the PDF if you'd like to download them, which I recommend. Now, this one is kind of similar to the last one where there's some boilerplate in the front, more than 778,000 amateur radio operators in the United States, emergency communication, regardless of your feelings on that. They're kind of using that as a way to get the people to potentially listen. Oh, emergency communication. Amateurs do that? Oh, we should help them out. It's not really a service in that sense, as you all know, but if called upon, we could fulfill that role. And sure, if we had faster data rates, that'd be great. But it goes on and on and on. This is a 5-page PDF that has a whole lot of just setting the groundwork, if you will. But the last part in particular is what hams are most interested in. So if you go to the very end of that PDF, this is the whole thing in a nutshell right here. It says, no later than 180 days after the date of enactment of this act. This is basically a bill that's saying, hey, FCC, get off your butt and get rid of this old requirement you had that is no longer meaningful. Kind of, I hate to say, they're kind of saying like, hey, FCC, go do your job. Like, make a change here. You don't need us to tell you. You've got all the power. We've given you the responsibility. Go make this happen. So this representative is kind of saying, hey, can we possibly get this done without us having to actually enact this? Can we do this without going to the Senate? Can the FCC just go make this happen? Of course they can, and they should. Save the taxpayers' money and just make this happen, FCC. It's very clear. Repeal the symbol rate or baud rate limits in Part 97, the FCC Part 97 of Title 47 Code of Federal Regulations, and adopt in place of such symbol or baud rate limits 2.8 kilohertz bandwidth limits for any single digital signal on the frequencies referred to in such part. That's it. That's all they need to do here. And that would greatly increase the amount of data we can move without taking up a lot more space. But in that space, because we can go much faster, it means we can finish transmitting much quicker and be off the bands, clearing it up for other uses. Now, if you ask my opinion on both these bills, I think they both should be enacted. Of course, as an amateur radio operator, I'd like to have more bandwidth for doing digital modes. And although I'm not affected by HOAs, there are so many people in our United States that really don't have choices for living outside of their work areas, and HOAs are the primary, if only, options they have for housing. And I feel that if the HOA obviously in many cases can't work with the radio amateur in allowing them some level of antenna setup or equipment setup, that the government's got to make a statement here and kind of say like, hey, look, you can't rob people of their freedoms when it comes to communication, and amateur radio is no exception to that. So yes, I support both, but I have a feeling that the HOA, and I don't know if you know this, guys, I'll post some links in the description on how powerful the HOAs are as a lobbying body and how much money they can throw around. They got a lot of it, and they lobby really hard. The last time the ARRL went up to do something like this, and I'm not saying they were involved in this necessarily, I'm making no claims on that, but in the past, something like this was tried before, and the lobbying got crazy. The bill was manipulated and changed to the point that it wasn't really as effective as it could have been or should have been, etc., whatever. I feel like this was pretty clean. Now, is this DOA as far as the HOA, the private land use? Maybe. I am not a politician, nor am I a legal scholar in this kind of case. I'm really just bringing you this information. So I would love to hear your thoughts below on what you think this is going to be. Do download that PDF. Do go check out those ARRL articles because they have insightful thoughts from many of the wise people that are at the ARRL. And then lastly, the symbol limit one, the baud rate limit. This is something the FCC should have solved a long time ago. The fact that there needed to be a bill from the House of Representatives that threatened to get the Senate involved to get it enacted and then force the FCC to do this. FCC, please just get rid of the symbol limit. Get rid of the baud rate limit. Decide what the bandwidth limit should be. 2.8 kilohertz is reasonable. I could see 2.4 kilohertz. Obviously, if you made it super wide, someone's going to come up with the ability to create software that will utilize all that space, and that could end up clogging up the bands. True statement. I get that. I'm not really advocating for something like that, but 2.8 seems kind of reasonable. But hey, I would love to hear all of your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching the Ham Radio Crash Course. I've got a link to another video here that you might find interesting. And until I talk at you again, 73.